Many couples dream of retirement as the golden reward after decades of hard work, believing it will be the time when they finally have the freedom to enjoy each other's company without the pressures of careers, raising children, or paying endless bills. They imagine peaceful mornings with coffee on the porch, long walks holding hands, quiet dinners, and maybe even traveling together to places they always wanted to see. It sounds perfect, but for many couples, the reality after 60 looks very different. Instead of a second honeymoon, they find themselves irritated with each other's habits, frustrated over little things, or even living in silence. The very closeness they once longed for feels stifling, and the dream of growing closer starts to feel like they are drifting further apart. The truth is, age does not automatically strengthen a relationship. In fact, for many couples, retirement exposes cracks that were easy to ignore when life was busier. When the kids were still at home, when work consumed most of the day, when there were endless tasks to complete, the relationship could hide behind distractions. But now, sitting in the same house day after day, the weaknesses become harder to overlook. Conversations dry up, tempers flare, and a kind of quiet distance can settle in like an unwelcome guest. What was supposed to be a season of love becomes a season of tension. This often leaves couples confused and even ashamed. They wonder, why is this happening to us? Shouldn't we be happier now that we finally have time together? But the truth is, closeness after 60 doesn't happen by accident. It happens by intention. Just as a garden left unattended will grow weeds, a relationship left on autopilot will lose its beauty. Love needs to be tended, even more so in these years, because this is the stage of life where connection matters most. The good news is this: it's never too late. Even if your relationship feels strained, even if you and your partner have fallen into patterns of silence or frustration, there are steps you can take to rebuild closeness. You can rediscover the spark, you can find joy in each other again, and you can create a bond that not only survives but thrives in this season. After all, you've already walked through so much together, raising children, enduring challenges, celebrating victories. The years after 60 don't have to be years of drifting apart. They can be the years where you grow stronger, closer, and more in love than ever before. That's why in this video, we're diving into 5 powerful ways to strengthen your relationship after 60, ways that can bring back connection, rebuild trust, and remind you why you chose each other in the first place. Stay until the end, because these truths may be exactly what your relationship needs right now. Harold and Margaret had been married for 42 years. They had raised 3 children, worked hard to pay off their mortgage, and built a life that looked steady from the outside. Their friends often admired them, saying things like, "You two are such a strong couple," or "You've made it through so much together." And in many ways, it was true. They had weathered financial struggles, disagreements about parenting, long hours at work, and even periods when they felt distant. But through it all, there was always another responsibility to pull them back together: children to raise, bills to pay, meals to cook, and careers that demanded their energy. Life was noisy and busy, and in that noise, the cracks in their relationship were easier to ignore. When retirement came, Harold was 67 and Margaret 65. They celebrated with a small dinner, toasting with glasses of wine and talking about all the things they would finally have time to do: travel, take up hobbies, visit their grandchildren more often. For the first few weeks, it felt like a second honeymoon. They lingered over breakfast, stayed up late watching old movies, and enjoyed the freedom of having no alarm clock. But slowly, the shine began to wear off. Harold had always been a man of routine. He thrived on structure, waking up early, having tasks to complete, and knowing that people depended on him. Without work, he felt restless. He began rising before Margaret, pacing the house, and grumbling about feeling useless. Margaret, on the other hand, had imagined retirement as a season of relaxation. She wanted slower mornings, time to garden, and long afternoons reading or chatting with friends. She resented Harold's constant complaints and felt as though he was dragging down her vision of their golden years. The tension built quietly at first. Margaret noticed Harold sighing heavily when she read a book instead of sitting with him. Harold grew irritated when she planned outings with her friends without him. Small arguments began, about how to load the dishwasher, how much money to spend on groceries, or who forgot to water the plants. None of these issues were big on their own, but each one chipped away at their closeness. The house, once filled with noise, now echoed with silence. What hurt the most was not the arguments themselves, but the growing distance. Harold often sat in the living room, staring at the television, while Margaret stayed in the kitchen scrolling on her tablet. They were in the same house, but it felt as though they were living in separate worlds. Sometimes, Margaret would look at Harold and wonder if he even noticed her anymore. Sometimes, Harold would look at Margaret and wonder if she still respected him. They loved each other deeply, but they no longer knew how to show it. It frightened them. After 4 decades of building a life together, was this what they were left with? 2 people sharing a roof but not a bond? Margaret worried that they were becoming strangers. Harold feared that he had already lost her in ways he couldn't articulate. Neither wanted to admit it, but both of them felt a quiet ache, a longing to reconnect but not knowing how. This is where their story turned. What could have been the slow unraveling of a lifelong marriage became instead a chance to rebuild. They realized they could not keep drifting. They needed to find intentional ways to strengthen their bond. It wasn't going to happen by accident. It had to be chosen. And it was through small but deliberate steps that Harold and Margaret began to discover that even after 60, love can grow stronger, deeper, and more resilient than ever before. Step 1. Prioritize communication. For Harold and Margaret, one of the biggest shifts after retirement was the sudden abundance of time together. At first, it seemed like a blessing. No more rushing out the door in the mornings, no more quick check-ins before bed, no more long evenings where Harold came home too exhausted to talk. But soon, the lack of structure exposed something they hadn't realized. They had stopped truly communicating years ago. Their conversations had mostly been about logistics, what bills were due, who was picking up the kids, what groceries needed buying. Now that those tasks had faded, they often found themselves sitting together in silence, not because they were comfortable but because they didn't know what to say. Harold assumed Margaret should already know how he was feeling, frustrated, restless, even scared of becoming useless. He believed that after 4 decades of marriage, she ought to be able to read his mind. But she couldn't. Margaret, on the other hand, kept her own frustrations bottled up. She felt that Harold criticized her too much, sighed when she wanted to enjoy quiet moments, and failed to notice her efforts to make the house warm and welcoming. She, too, believed he should just know how she felt without her needing to explain. That unspoken tension built day after day, until small irritations flared into sharp words. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Margaret broke the silence. "Harold, we don't talk anymore." "Not really. We sit in the same room, but it feels like we're miles apart." Harold, at first defensive, replied, "What is there to talk about? We've said everything over the years." But later, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words echoed in his mind. He realized she was right. Their love was not dying because of arguments, it was fading because of silence. The next morning, Harold suggested something simple. They would set aside 30 minutes each evening to sit down together without distractions. No television, no phones, no chores. Just the 2 of them talking. At first, it was awkward. They didn't know where to begin. Margaret asked about Harold's feelings on retirement. Harold hesitated, then admitted, "I feel like I don't matter anymore." That confession opened a door. Margaret, in turn, shared how lonely she felt when he withdrew into himself. Slowly, honesty began to flow again. They learned to listen without interrupting, to ask questions instead of assuming, and to share not only frustrations but also small joys. Harold told Margaret how much he appreciated her cooking, something he hadn't said in years. Margaret told Harold how safe she still felt when he fixed things around the house. These weren't grand speeches, but they were reminders that they still valued each other. Communication became their lifeline. They discovered that after 60, words carried even more weight than before. Speaking openly about fears, dreams, and even mundane details brought them closer. It wasn't about always agreeing, it was about knowing they were heard. For Harold, hearing Margaret's laughter during their evening talks felt like rediscovering the woman he had first fallen in love with. For Margaret, Hearing Harold admit his vulnerabilities reminded her that beneath his stubbornness was the man who had always wanted to protect and provide for her. Their marriage began to feel lighter. The arguments didn't vanish, but now they had a safe space to resolve them. Instead of letting resentment fester, they could address it in their nightly conversations. Instead of assuming, they could clarify. The house no longer felt so heavy with silence because they had learned to fill it with words that healed instead of wounded. For couples after 60, prioritizing communication is not optional, it is essential. It is easy to believe that decades together mean you already know everything about your partner. But people change, feelings shift, and life brings new challenges. Just as Harold and Margaret discovered, real intimacy comes not from guessing but from listening, not from silence but from words. A strong relationship is built on the courage to say, "This is how I feel," and the patience to reply, "I hear you." What about you? When was the last time you and your partner had an uninterrupted, honest conversation about your hearts and not just about daily chores? Maybe tonight is the time to start. Just 30 minutes of talking, truly talking, could be the beginning of rebuilding closeness in your golden years. Step 2. Rediscover shared activities. For Harold and Margaret, one of the most painful realizations after retirement was how little they actually did together anymore. During the working years, their lives had been filled with teamwork, raising children, planning holidays, managing household chores, even just sharing the same schedule of exhaustion and relief. They weren't always intentional about it, but those shared activities bonded them. Now, with the children gone and careers behind them, their routines drifted apart. Harold spent long mornings flipping through television channels, while Margaret spent hours in the garden or on the phone with her friends. They were living parallel lives under the same roof, intersecting mostly at meals, and even then, the conversations were shallow or tense. One Saturday morning, Margaret looked across the breakfast table and realized she could not remember the last time she and Harold had actually done something together. They were becoming strangers who simply shared bills and space. That thought frightened her. She brought it up cautiously, saying, "Do you ever miss how we used to just enjoy each other's company?" Harold, defensive at first, muttered, "We're older now, things change." But the truth was, he felt it too. Their marriage felt like two tracks running side by side, never quite touching. The turning point came when their daughter invited them to help babysit their grandchildren one weekend. At first, Harold groaned about the noise and energy it would require, but Margaret insisted they go. What surprised them both was how natural it felt to team up again. Harold built Lego towers on the floor while Margaret baked cookies with the children. They caught each other's eyes across the room, laughing at the chaos, and for the first time in months, they felt connected. On the drive home, Harold admitted, "That was actually fun. We should do more things like that." That night, Margaret suggested they create a list of activities they could try together. It didn't have to be extravagant. They wrote down simple things: evening walks, cooking new recipes, working on a puzzle, attending a local concert, even tackling small home projects side by side. The key wasn't the activity itself, it was the act of sharing. And as they began checking off items from the list, their bond grew lighter, warmer, and stronger. One of their favorite rediscoveries was walking after dinner. At first, it was just a few blocks, often in silence. But over time, the rhythm of walking side by side opened up conversations that felt natural and unforced. They began to look forward to those walks, sometimes holding hands, sometimes just enjoying the quiet companionship. On weekends, they experimented with cooking meals together, Harold chopping vegetables while Margaret stirred the pot. The kitchen, once a place of unspoken tension, became a place of laughter and small teamwork. Rediscovering shared activities reminded them of their younger days, the picnics when they were dating, the road trips with toddlers in the back seat, the projects they once tackled with excitement. These new activities didn't erase their challenges, but they gave them fresh reasons to smile at each other. Slowly, the walls of silence that had been building began to crumble. For couples after 60, shared activities are not about busyness, they are about bonding. They create opportunities for laughter, teamwork, and companionship that words alone sometimes cannot. When you do life with your partner instead of beside your partner, you breathe life back into the relationship. What about you? Is there one activity you and your partner could try this week? It doesn't need to be expensive or grand. It could be as simple as a card game after dinner, planting flowers together, or baking bread side by side. These small, intentional moments can stitch your hearts closer than you realize, just as they did for Harold and Margaret. Step 3. Show daily appreciation. One of the most subtle but damaging shifts that crept into Harold and Margaret's marriage after retirement was the quiet erosion of gratitude. After more than 4 decades together, they had grown so used to each other's presence that they stopped noticing the little things. Harold would come in from fixing a leaky tap, wipe his hands on a towel, and slump in front of the television without a word. Margaret would spend an hour preparing dinner, set it on the table, and watch him eat without acknowledgement. It wasn't that they didn't value each other's efforts. Deep down, they did, but the words were gone. Over time, silence where there should have been gratitude began to feel like indifference. Margaret once told a friend over tea, "I sometimes feel invisible in my own home. I cook, clean, plan our days, but it's like Harold doesn't even notice." Harold, in turn, confided to his brother, "I fix things, I try to help out, but it feels like she only points out what I do wrong." Neither of them realized that the absence of appreciation was draining their relationship of warmth. Familiarity had bred not just comfort, but complacency. The turning point came one afternoon when Margaret's back ached from hours of working in the garden. Harold noticed her wincing as she sat down and, without thinking, he said, "Thank you for keeping the garden so beautiful. I don't say it enough, but it really makes the house feel alive." Margaret looked at him, surprised. Her eyes softened. It had been so long since he had said something kind about her work that the simple sentence felt like water to a thirsty plant. That evening, when Harold handed her the mail he had fetched from outside, Margaret smiled and said, "Thank you for always handling the little things. It saves me so much trouble." It was a small exchange, but it shifted the atmosphere between them. From that day, they made a conscious effort to speak words of appreciation daily. Harold began thanking Margaret for her meals, even when it was something simple like soup and bread. Margaret started noticing Harold's small acts of care, from changing light bulbs to making sure the car had enough fuel. These acknowledgements didn't take much effort, but they had a profound effect. They reminded each other that their contributions still mattered, that they were still seen, still valued. What surprised them most was how this simple practice softened conflicts. Arguments that once spiraled now seemed smaller when surrounded by words of kindness. Harold found himself less defensive when Margaret thanked him before pointing out a mistake. Margaret felt less overlooked when Harold noticed her efforts. Appreciation became a buffer, a cushion that made the inevitable frictions of daily life less sharp. They also discovered that appreciation wasn't limited to chores. Harold began complimenting Margaret's appearance, telling her she looked lovely in her new blouse. Margaret began acknowledging Harold's humor, laughing at his jokes and telling him she was glad he still made her smile. These comments, though simple, rekindled affection and reminded them of the early days of their love. Over time, daily appreciation became a habit, something they both looked forward to. They even created a small ritual before bed. Each would say one thing they were grateful for about the other that day. Sometimes it was as small as, "I appreciated your company during our walk." Other times it was as heartfelt as, "I'm grateful we're still facing life together after all these years." These nightly words became the glue that held them close, even when the day had been difficult. For couples over 60, showing daily appreciation may seem unnecessary. After all, shouldn't decades together prove love enough? But the truth is, love that isn't spoken begins to feel invisible. Words matter, even more with age, when insecurities about being needed or valued begin to surface. Harold and Margaret discovered that gratitude is like oxygen, invisible, but without it, the relationship suffocates. With it, even the smallest gestures come alive with meaning. What about you? When was the last time you looked at your partner and said, "Thank you for being here with me"? It may feel small, but like Harold and Margaret learned, those few words can reignite warmth, remind your partner of their worth, and strengthen the bond that holds your hearts together. Step 4. Keep intimacy alive. For Harold and Margaret, intimacy was one of the most delicate and misunderstood areas of their marriage after 60. Over the years, the physical side of their relationship had naturally changed. There were no more hurried kisses in the kitchen while children clamored for attention, no more stolen moments of passion after long days of work. Instead, intimacy had slowly slipped into the background, replaced by routines, habits, and, at times, distance. Neither of them spoke much about it, but both felt the absence. Harold sometimes worried that Margaret no longer found him attractive. Margaret, in turn, sometimes wondered if Harold even noticed her anymore beyond her role in the household. This silence created an invisible wall between them. They weren't fighting, but they weren't connecting either. Harold would sit in his recliner, Margaret in her favorite chair, and evenings would pass with little more than the sound of the television. They loved each other, but the closeness they once enjoyed seemed to have faded into memory. The shift began one ordinary evening when Margaret was washing dishes. Harold, instead of heading straight for the living room, walked into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her waist. Startled, she looked at him, but his eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen in a long time. "I just wanted to hold you," he whispered. That small gesture, simple, genuine, unforced, broke the silence. Margaret smiled, a little shyly, and leaned into him. They stood there for a few moments, saying nothing, just sharing the comfort of touch. From then on, they began to rediscover intimacy in small ways. It wasn't about trying to recapture their youth, but about creating closeness that fit their season of life. Holding hands during their evening walks, brushing shoulders as they cooked together, sharing a blanket while watching a movie, each of these gestures reminded them that they were more than just companions. They were still husband and wife, partners whose love deserved to be nurtured. Margaret also realized that intimacy was not just about physical touch but about emotional openness. She started sharing her worries with Harold instead of keeping them to herself. Harold, in turn, began expressing his admiration for her, telling her how much he appreciated her wisdom, her patience, and her enduring beauty. These words rekindled the sense of being desired and valued, something they had both quietly longed for. For Harold, keeping intimacy alive also meant being willing to slow down and focus on presence instead of performance. At their age, it wasn't about grand gestures or trying to recreate their 20s. It was about meaningful connection, looking into each other's eyes, whispering kind words, and letting touch communicate love. Margaret often said, "It's not about passion fading. It's about finding new ways to show we still belong to each other." Their grandchildren once teased them when they saw Harold gently place his arm around Margaret during a family outing. But instead of embarrassment, Harold smiled proudly. He wanted the world to see that his love for her was still alive, still worth showing. Margaret, too, began initiating small gestures of affection, a kiss on the cheek before bed, a squeeze of his hand while they prayed together, even playful nudges that made them both laugh. The impact was profound. The more they practiced small acts of intimacy, the more connected they felt in every area of their marriage. Their arguments softened, their laughter returned, and the sense of being just roommates disappeared. Harold admitted one evening, "I don't feel invisible anymore." Margaret replied, "And I don't feel taken for granted." For couples after 60, intimacy is not about chasing youth. It's about creating closeness that reflects the depth of decades together. It's about reminding each other daily, "I still see you. I still love you. I still choose you." That truth, spoken through touch, words, and presence, can transform a quiet house into a home filled with warmth. What about you? What is one small gesture of intimacy you could show your partner today? A hug, a kind word, a touch on the shoulder. These simple acts might be the spark that keeps your love alive in this beautiful stage of life. Step 5. Grow spiritually or emotionally together. For Harold and Margaret, one of the deepest realizations of their retirement years was that their relationship needed more than just routines, activities, or even affection. It needed an anchor. For decades, their marriage had been pulled along by responsibilities, raising children, managing finances, keeping up with work schedules, and balancing family obligations. Those things, though demanding, gave them a sense of shared purpose. But once those demands fell away, They discovered that without something deeper binding them together, it was all too easy to drift. Margaret was the first to notice the void. She felt it during quiet evenings when the house grew still, and she wondered what they were really building together now that their main responsibilities were over. Harold, though less expressive, felt it too. He sometimes sat in his recliner and thought, is this all there is left, waiting for the days to pass? The danger wasn't just boredom, it was the risk of growing spiritually and emotionally apart. The turning point came unexpectedly. Their church announced a small group for couples navigating retirement and invited them to join. Harold resisted at first, muttering, "We don't need to sit around talking about feelings with strangers." But Margaret gently urged him, and eventually, he agreed. On their first evening, they sat in a circle of couples who looked just like them, gray hair, tired eyes, and a quiet longing for something more. As each couple shared their struggles and hopes, Harold and Margaret realized they weren't alone. Retirement was not just a change in lifestyle, it was a profound emotional and spiritual transition. Through those weekly gatherings, Harold and Margaret began to open up to each other in ways they hadn't for years. They prayed together, sometimes awkwardly at first, but gradually with sincerity. They read short devotionals or inspirational passages, discussing how they applied to their marriage. Margaret found comfort in Harold's willingness to engage, and Harold discovered a renewed sense of respect for Margaret's gentle faith and insight. It wasn't just about religion, it was about connecting on a level beyond chores, routines, and surface conversations. Outside of church, they began creating their own rituals of emotional and spiritual closeness. In the mornings, instead of rushing into separate activities, they sat with coffee and shared one thing they hoped for that day. In the evenings, they reflected on one thing they were grateful for. These small practices gave their relationship a rhythm of meaning. They weren't just sharing space, they were sharing hearts. Their intimacy grew deeper. Holding hands while saying a quiet prayer before meals reminded them that they were partners in more than just survival. Discussing their values, their dreams for their children and grandchildren, and even their fears about aging gave them courage to face the future together. They found that by looking beyond themselves, whether through faith, community, or shared goals, they strengthened the bond between them. For Harold, the greatest surprise was how much lighter he felt. The frustrations that once seemed overwhelming lost their power when balanced against a deeper sense of purpose. For Margaret, the joy was in feeling truly connected again, not just as husband and wife but as companions walking a meaningful path side by side. For couples after 60, growing spiritually or emotionally together is like building a lighthouse. It gives direction when the waters of life feel stormy and provides a steady beam of light that keeps you from drifting apart. It doesn't require perfection or complicated practices, just a willingness to open your hearts and share something deeper than daily routines. What about you? Do you and your partner have something that grounds you, faith, a shared practice, or even regular time to reflect together? It could be prayer, journaling, meditation, or simply setting aside time to talk about your hopes. Like Harold and Margaret discovered, when you grow spiritually or emotionally together, your love not only survives retirement, it thrives, becoming stronger than you ever thought possible. Harold and Margaret's journey is a reminder that love after 60 is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Retirement exposed their weaknesses, but it also gave them the space to address what had been buried for years. They discovered that relationships don't wither because of age, they wither when they are neglected. But when you nurture them with communication, shared activities, daily appreciation, intimacy, and a deeper spiritual or emotional connection, they grow stronger than ever before. They learn that small, consistent steps matter more than grand gestures. A simple thank you, a walk after dinner, a gentle touch in the kitchen, or a shared reflection before bed became the glue that held them together. They weren't trying to recreate their 20s, they were building a love that fit their 60s and 70s, a love marked by patience, kindness, and understanding. And what they discovered is true for every couple. No matter how long you've been together, no matter how distant you may feel right now, it is never too late to grow closer. If you are in your golden years and find yourself struggling with silence, frustration, or even the fear of drifting apart, take heart. You still have the power to strengthen your bond. You still have time to rebuild connection. Your story is not over, and your love can still deepen in ways you never imagined. The golden years don't have to be years of loneliness or regret. They can be the years of renewed joy, laughter, and closeness. If Harold and Margaret's story encouraged you, tap like right now. It tells YouTube this message matters. Share this video with a friend over 60 who deserves a stronger, more joyful relationship. And subscribe to Love and Life After 60, because your later years should not be filled with distance but with peace, companionship, and love that endures.